Saint Porphyrios saw what we refused to believe. While the world celebrated progress, this orthodox mystic documented the invisible architecture of family destruction, forces so subtle they operated beneath conscious awareness. He didn't speak in abstractions. He named the systems, identified the methods, and predicted the collapse with disturbing accuracy. Every institution you were taught to trust, he warned, had been quietly repurposed. What he revealed wasn't conspiracy. It was spiritual warfare made visible. And now, decades later, the evidence surrounds us like wreckage we can no longer ignore. Saint Porphyrios of Kavsokalivia lived most of his life in deliberate obscurity, a monk whose spiritual vision penetrated layers of reality that rationalist minds dismiss as superstition or metaphor. Born in 1906 to a poverty-stricken family in rural Greece, he entered monastic life as a teenager, driven not by romantic notions of holiness, but by an overwhelming awareness of invisible realms pressing against the surface of ordinary existence. Those who knew him described encounters that defied medical explanation. He could perceive illnesses in bodies he never examined, read thoughts unspoken, and sense spiritual disturbances in homes he had never visited. But his most disturbing gift, the one that earned him both reverence and suspicion, was his prophetic clarity about the future of human civilization. He saw, with terrible precision, the mechanisms that would be deployed to dismantle the foundational structure of society, the family itself. His warnings began in earnest during the 1960s and 1970s, precisely when Western culture was celebrating liberation from traditional constraints. While intellectuals praised the dismantling of patriarchal structures and the expansion of individual autonomy, Porphyrios watched with mounting alarm as patterns emerged that others couldn't yet recognize. He didn't speak in the apocalyptic rhetoric common to religious doomsayers. Instead, he identified specific systems, educational institutions, media networks, governmental policies, that he claimed were being subtly reconfigured to separate children from parents, spouses from each other, and families from their spiritual foundation. What made his prophecies particularly unsettling was their specificity. He didn't predict vague moral decline. He described exact methodologies, curriculum changes that would undermine parental authority, entertainment that would normalize family fragmentation, and legal frameworks that would incentivize household dissolution. The Orthodox faithful who sought his counsel received guidance that sounded radical even in traditional religious contexts. He told parents to treat their homes as besieged fortresses, to scrutinize every external influence with wartime vigilance, and to recognize that the battle for their children's souls was being waged through seemingly benign channels, schoolbooks, television programs, and playground conversations. He warned that the assault wouldn't announce itself with obvious evil, but would arrive disguised as progress, compassion, and enlightenment. The most dangerous weapons, he insisted, were those that parents would welcome into their homes voluntarily, believing they were providing advantages for their children. His metaphors were militaristic and uncompromising. The modern family, he declared, existed in occupied territory, surrounded by forces that viewed traditional bonds as obstacles to be systematically dismantled. Many dismissed him as an alarmist, a relic of pre-modern thinking, unable to adapt to contemporary complexity. His critics, even within Orthodox circles, suggested that his isolation from urban life had distorted his perspective, that his monastic worldview couldn't account for genuine social progress. They pointed to expanded rights, reduced violence, and increased access to education as evidence that modernity was liberating humanity rather than destroying it. But Porphyrios remained unmoved by these arguments. He insisted that surface improvements masked deeper structural damage, that the metrics by which society measured progress were themselves compromised. He spoke of a generation of children who would grow into adults incapable of forming lasting bonds, unable to distinguish authentic love from temporary attraction, and fundamentally disconnected from the spiritual realities that had sustained human communities for millennia. His vision wasn't of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual erosion, families weakening across generations until the very concept of permanent commitment became incomprehensible. His method of spiritual counsel reflected this apocalyptic awareness. When families came to him seeking guidance, he didn't offer generic platitudes about prayer and attendance at services. He provided tactical instructions with military precision, specific prayers to recite at specific times, physical arrangements of the home designed to create spiritual barriers against external influences, and detailed strategies for monitoring and filtering the information entering children's consciousness. He told parents to view themselves as intelligence operatives behind enemy lines, responsible for protecting their children from psychological warfare disguised as education and entertainment. His recommendations often shocked even devout believers. He suggested extreme measures like removing televisions entirely, limiting contact with extended family members who undermined religious teaching, and homeschooling children to prevent exposure to institutional indoctrination. These weren't suggestions born from paranoia, but from his claimed perception of spiritual realities invisible to ordinary sight. The most chilling aspect of his prophecies wasn't their content, but their timing. He delivered these warnings decades before the statistical evidence would validate his concerns, before family dissolution became quantifiable crisis, before the mechanisms he identified became visible to sociological analysis. He died in 1991, just as the patterns he predicted were beginning to manifest in measurable ways. Rising rates of family fragmentation, documented declines in child well-being, and the emergence of institutional frameworks that actively worked against family cohesion. His followers believe he was granted prophetic sight precisely to warn a generation that wouldn't recognize the danger until it was too late. His critics maintain he was simply a pessimistic traditionalist whose grim predictions became self-fulfilling prophecies among those who believed him. But the question that haunts both camps is this: what if he was right? What if the forces he identified are real, coordinated and accelerating? What if the modern family isn't failing by accident, but by design? Saint Porphyrios didn't speak in abstractions about societal decline. He identified specific institutional mechanisms that he claimed were systematically engineered to fragment family bonds, and his analysis focused on three primary vectors: educational systems, media networks, and governmental policies. Each, he insisted, operated under the pretense of serving family welfare while implementing methodologies designed to undermine parental authority and dissolve the psychological bonds that held households together. His critique of education was particularly detailed. He warned that curriculum reforms throughout the Western world were deliberately structured to create ideological distance between children and their parents, teaching children to view their families' beliefs as outdated, oppressive, or harmful. He predicted that schools would increasingly position themselves not as extensions of parental will, but as corrective institutions responsible for liberating children from family influence. The educational assault, as he described it, operated through subtle psychological techniques rather than overt indoctrination. Children would be encouraged to question parental authority through critical thinking exercises that framed traditional beliefs as subjects for skeptical analysis rather than inherited wisdom. Sex education programs would introduce concepts and normalize behaviors that contradicted family values, creating moral dissonance that separated children from their parents' ethical framework. Social emotional learning initiatives would teach children to prioritize their individual feelings and identity explorations over family expectations and cultural continuity. He warned that teachers would be trained to identify signs of religious or traditional influence as potential indicators of abuse or neglect, transforming educators into surveillance agents, monitoring families for ideological deviance. The goal, he insisted, wasn't education in any classical sense, but the systematic reprogramming of each generation to view family bonds as optional, temporary, and potentially harmful. His warnings about media proved equally prophetic in their specificity. He predicted that entertainment would normalize family dysfunction to the point where stable, loving households would appear abnormal or fictitious. Television programs and films would portray parents as incompetent, oppressive, or absent, teaching children that adult authority was something to be subverted or escaped, rather than respected. He foresaw that children's entertainment especially would be weaponized, presenting rebellion against family as heroic, and conformity to parental guidance as cowardice or stupidity. The messaging wouldn't be crude propaganda, but sophisticated narrative techniques that made family dissolution appear natural, inevitable, and even liberating. He warned that the most dangerous content would be that which parents perceived as harmless: animated films, children's programs, and educational content that embedded subversive messages beneath entertaining surfaces. The governmental dimension of this assault involved policy frameworks that economically incentivized family dissolution while penalizing family cohesion. Porphyrios warned of welfare systems that rewarded single parenthood, divorce laws that made marriage dissolution financially advantageous, and tax structures that punished traditional single-income families. He predicted that governments would increasingly intervene in family life under the guise of protecting children, establishing bureaucratic mechanisms that empowered state authorities to override parental decisions regarding education, healthcare, and moral guidance. He foresaw mandatory reporting requirements that would turn teachers, doctors, and social workers into informants, creating surveillance networks that monitored families for any deviation from state-approved parenting methodologies. The ultimate goal, he claimed, was to position government as the primary authority over children, relegating parents to the role of temporary caretakers whose rights could be suspended whenever their decisions conflicted with institutional preferences. What made his analysis particularly disturbing was his insistence that these forces weren't merely parallel trends, but coordinated elements of a larger strategy. He spoke of spiritual warfare in literal terms, actual demonic intelligences working through human institutions to accomplish specific objectives. This wasn't metaphorical language for him. He claimed to perceive spiritual entities influencing policymakers, curriculum designers, and media executives, guiding them toward decisions that advanced family destruction even when the human actors believed they were promoting compassion, progress, or child welfare. He described a hierarchy of spiritual warfare, where low-level demonic forces exploited human weakness and selfishness, while higher-level entities coordinated long-term strategies that spanned generations. The sophistication of this warfare lay in its invisibility. The forces operated through systems that appeared entirely naturalistic, leaving no obvious evidence of supernatural coordination. His proposed defense against these forces was equally radical. He insisted that families couldn't simply moderate their engagement with modern institutions. They needed to withdraw from them as completely as circumstances allowed. He advocated for the creation of parallel structures, religious schools that explicitly rejected state curriculum mandates, community networks that provided economic support independent of government assistance, and media ecosystems that operated outside mainstream distribution channels. He called this approach building a spiritual fortress, a metaphor that captured both the defensive posture required and the sense of siege under which faithful families existed. The fortress wasn't physical but psychological and spiritual, a family culture so robust, so internally coherent, that external influences couldn't penetrate it. This required extraordinary vigilance, he warned, because the forces arrayed against the family were tireless, sophisticated, and committed to multi-generational campaigns that could outlast individual resistance. The evidence supporting his warnings has accumulated with disturbing consistency. Statistical data now documents patterns he predicted decades ago: rising rates of family dissolution, declining marriage rates, increasing percentages of children raised in single-parent households, and measurable decreases in child well-being across multiple indicators. Educational research has revealed the ideological components of curriculum design he warned about. Media analysis has documented the normalization of family dysfunction he predicted, and policy studies have traced the economic incentives for family fragmentation he identified. What was dismissed as religious paranoia, when he spoke it has become sociological consensus. The question is no longer whether families are under assault, but whether the assault is accidental or intentional, reactive or coordinated. Saint Porphyrios insisted it was the latter, and the evidence increasingly suggests he may have been right. Saint Porphyrios understood that identifying the problem wasn't sufficient. Families needed concrete, implementable strategies to survive the forces arrayed against them. His spiritual fortress concept wasn't a retreat from the world, but a tactical repositioning, a way of engaging with modern society while maintaining impenetrable internal coherence. The first principle of fortress construction was radical prioritization. Parents had to accept that protecting their children's spiritual formation took absolute precedence over economic advancement, social acceptance, or personal ambition. This meant making choices that appeared irrational by conventional standards, turning down promotions that required excessive work hours, refusing educational opportunities that would expose children to hostile ideological environments, and accepting social marginalization rather than compromising family integrity. He warned that parents would face intense pressure to prioritize their children's worldly success over their spiritual well-being, and that resisting this pressure would require courage that most modern people no longer possessed. The practical implementation of fortress living involved meticulous control over the information and influences entering the household. Porphyrios advocated for what contemporary observers would call extreme media restriction, complete elimination of television in many cases, careful curation of all reading material, and constant supervision of peer relationships. He insisted that parents needed to view every external influence as potentially hostile until proven otherwise, operating under the assumption that the default cultural current flowed toward family dissolution. This meant investigating schools with the thoroughness of security analysts, questioning curriculum content, scrutinizing teachers' ideological commitments, and maintaining constant communication with children about what they encountered outside the home. He recommended that families establish regular times for explicit counter-programming, discussions where parents directly addressed and refuted the messages children absorbed from external sources, teaching them to recognize manipulation techniques and ideological subversion. The spiritual disciplines he prescribed were equally demanding. He insisted that fortress families needed to maintain daily prayer routines with the consistency of military drills, that homes needed to be physically marked with religious symbols and icons that created visible barriers against spiritual attack, and that children needed to be raised with intimate familiarity with religious texts and practices from earliest consciousness. This wasn't optional devotion but essential fortification, the spiritual equivalent of weapons training and defensive positioning. He taught that prayer created actual energetic barriers that demonic forces couldn't penetrate, that icons functioned as portals through which divine protection entered physical space, and that regular participation in religious sacraments built spiritual immunity against external corruption. These practices had to be performed with genuine faith and understanding, not mere ritualism, because empty religious forms provided no protection against sophisticated spiritual warfare. The social cost of implementing this strategy was substantial and needed to be accepted from the outset. Families who followed Porphyrios's guidance found themselves increasingly isolated from mainstream culture, viewed as extremists by neighbors, criticized by extended family members, and sometimes investigated by authorities suspicious of their non-conformity. Children raised in fortress households appeared strange to their peers, unfamiliar with popular culture, uncomfortable with casual moral relativism, and unwilling to participate in activities that compromised their family's values. This social awkwardness could create intense pressure on both children and parents to moderate their stance, to find compromises that would ease the friction between their household and the surrounding culture. Porphyrios warned that these pressures were themselves weapons in spiritual warfare, designed to wear down resistance through gradual erosion rather than direct assault. He insisted that families needed to choose their battles, but never compromise on core principles, maintaining absolute firmness on essential matters while showing tactical flexibility on peripheral issues. The economic dimension of fortress living presented equally serious challenges. Single-income households faced financial pressures that dual-income families didn't experience, and the decision to homeschool or use religious schools often required significant financial sacrifice. Porphyrios acknowledged these difficulties, but insisted that families needed to radically simplify their material expectations, accepting lower living standards in exchange for greater control over their children's formation. He pointed to historical examples of Christian communities that thrived under persecution, precisely because they maintained this prioritization, material poverty combined with spiritual wealth, social marginalization combined with internal solidarity. He warned that the modern economic system was designed to force both parents into workforce participation, not because family survival required it, but because separated parents had less time and energy to resist institutional influence over their children. The solution wasn't better time management, but fundamental restructuring of family economics around the priority of child formation rather than consumption maximization. The most difficult aspect of the fortress strategy was maintaining it across the entire developmental period of childhood and adolescence. Porphyrios warned that many families would implement strict protections during early childhood, but gradually relax them as children aged, believing that older children needed more independence and could handle increased exposure to mainstream culture. This, he insisted, was precisely when families were most vulnerable, because adolescents faced peer pressure and identity formation challenges that made them particularly susceptible to external influence. The fortress needed to remain intact through the teenage years, even as that meant accepting conflict with children who resented restrictions their peers didn't face. He counseled parents to view this conflict as confirmation they were doing the right thing. Rebellion against protective boundaries was evidence that external forces were attempting to exploit natural adolescent desires for independence and peer acceptance. The goal wasn't to prevent all conflict, but to ensure that when children eventually made their own choices as adults, they did so with full awareness of the alternatives and the consequences, rather than defaulting to cultural norms they'd never been taught to question. Saint Porphyrios died before the full manifestation of the crisis he predicted, but his followers maintain detailed records of families who implemented his strategy and their outcomes. The evidence they present is anecdotal but consistent. Children raised in fortress households show significantly higher rates of maintaining religious faith into adulthood, forming stable marriages, and creating their own intact families. They report lower rates of mental health crisis, substance issues, and the characteristic aimlessness that marks so much of contemporary young adulthood. But they also acknowledge the costs, the social isolation, the economic sacrifice, the constant vigilance required, and the reality that even fortress families aren't immune to failure. The strategy isn't a guarantee, but a fighting chance, a way to resist forces that otherwise prove overwhelming. And as the statistical evidence of family collapse accumulates, as the mechanisms Porphyrios identified become increasingly visible and documented, even his critics are beginning to ask whether his radical approach might have been not paranoia but prophecy, a warning that we dismissed at precisely the moment we most needed to heed it.